So moving to the other side of this, where does this leave the legacy car companies who have these relationships with their dealer networks and are in this sort of catch-22 of like, okay, well, I'm still relying on all my dealers, but I'm also seeing that the internet exists. There's an opportunity for me to go direct. Companies that are, winning like Tesla and Rivian are going direct. How does this put companies like GM and Ford and the relationships with their dealer networks?
Yeah, I have heard some sort of behind the scenes chatter about how automakers feel like maybe it's a little bit unfair because you have some automakers who can sell direct, but other ones can't. But then again, the traditional manufacturers, the ones who agree to these franchise agreements with these dealers. And so it does really put them in an interesting situation as consumer preference for car buying and car shopping changes. I think that that's what it's really coming down to. Consumers' preferences for the car buying experience is shifting. People are wising up to the fact that the dealership experience, in large part, is just not a very fun process for many reasons. So if you remove that friction, like Tesla has done and like Rivian will do, I think it's appealing to a lot of consumers. And so, what do these traditional manufacturers do? Let's just sort of go down that road of, let's say that this idea of going direct to manufacturer because of little friction catches momentum with consumers. You then have these traditional manufacturers who have these existing agreements with dealerships who are sort of in between a rock and a hard place because they might need to capitalize on the shifting buyer experience preference. And how do they do that if they have these franchise agreements with these dealers? So a couple of ideas that I have. Number one, we might see that manufacturers buy out the dealership agreements with these dealerships. So that's one possible solution. It gets them the employees, it gets them the inventory, it gets them the facilities in these different cities. That could be an interesting strategy for traditional automakers. The other one that I'm paying a really close attention to is manufacturers who either acquire an electric vehicle manufacturer outright and make that a subsidiary brand of the company, or they buy a majority stake in an EV startup so that they can have controlling decisions over what that company does. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Wow. Yeah, no, a lot you said right there. I think the buyout of something to get around the legislation makes sense, but I also think this is just such a mess. Like, we're hitting on a bigger trend, which is like direct to consumer. Like, this isn't just happening for cars, it's happening for every consumer product. The manufacturer is going right to the consumer because this is a better experience. Like, I don't think consumer preferences have changed. I think the technology's changed and we have the internet, and like, you can know about things. You don't need to rely on your dealer to be the only source of information. And like, the car industry's just been super resistant to that change. And the other thing that's so interesting is like the incentives. Like, Tesla says we don't want to make money on service, yet dealers are making all their money on service. So when you talk about how the incentives are aligned at that core customer level, like, I just think these dealers are set up to like not be on the customer's side, and that is just a huge. And that's why like the pricing sucks. They're all about service. Like, that they don't want to sell electric vehicles because there's no maintenance fees. Like, it's just, that's the root of all of these problems. Like, but if I was GM or Ford, I would do what you're saying, like acquire a stake in a smaller EV brand. I was actually listening to Tesla Daily yesterday, and he brought up this really good point that's like, why are all these EV companies trying to launch like a lineup of, or like GM trying to launch like 10 EVs, like a lineup of like, here's a Cadillac, here's this other Cadillac, here's this Bolt, here's this Hummer. It's like, why don't you just build one EV that can sell well, instead of like trying to do 10 EVs that none of which will work. But so I don't know. I'm getting a little.
It's the same sort of process that they've always done. The show concept cars that don't come out for 5 years, and then it looks completely different. It is very much a sort of automotive manufacturing smoke and mirrors. It's like, okay, we're going to get people really excited about this, and then we're going to change it up on them, so it looks and sounds completely different. But yeah, I mean, the execution piece, is all that matters. And so you can, I watched your video about GM, the GM event, and it's true that all that really matters is executing. And if you're not setting firm deadlines or timelines, and you're not talking about, cost and price, how serious is GM or are these companies? And so what I think consumers really want is just someone to say what they're going to do and deliver on it as much as possible on time.
Yeah, and I think consumers are voting with their wallets. Like we're seeing Tesla outsell all this competition, with that direct to consumer model, despite the fact that in many states they've had these legal headaches.